but something we talked about before we started the call, which I think is probably the single biggest problem institutionalized from an academic standpoint that I see here. I had Richard Reeves on my program. He said one of the reasons why Andrew Tate became so popular was our fault. We refused to have the conversation about the idea that men suffer. If you were to go to a college campus like now Berkeley or Harvard, and you were to do a course, Connor, called "Why Men Suffer," they would throw vegetables at you as soon as you came out of your lecture. Nobody. Again, we know that men are more likely to take their own lives, are more likely to suffer from mental disorders. They're more likely to be the victims of violent crime, more likely to suffer from homelessness and schizophrenia, autism, things like this, and also, more likely to be zeroed out, more likely to have their children taken away after a divorce. We know that a lot of these things happen. And I believe there's one stat that shows over the age of 40, you've been financially zeroed out and you've been divorced, you're something like 8 times more likely to take your own life than the general population.
Yeah.
But academia didn't want to look at this issue. And so because of that, because there was this group of people that were feeling disenfranchised, like you said before, they weren't even told that they weren't suffering. They were told that they didn't even exist. Like their problems weren't even real. And of course, Andrew Tate now becomes the most popular person in the world. He's the most Googled person in the world, in part because no one looked at this subject. This was Richard Reeves who told me this. And I was like, it's very insightful for him as an academician to admit to that. One of the things I want to talk about is it doesn't seem, we've talked about this several times, the article that the American Psychological Association came out with saying that they found traditional masculinity to be harmful. And they specifically named the term stoicism, which I thought was really interesting. Stoicism is being harmful. And I just thought it was, you mentioned something before. I feel like therapy now, I believe that I read the statistic that under the age of 30, only 5% of therapists are men, that has downstream ramifications. If only 5% of therapists are men at the age of 30, if that's the case, what it seems like Jordan Peterson said, he said the idea of traditional masculinity being harmful is not, it's salacious, it's scandalous. He said it's anti-truth. And so I was just wondering what you, in your experience, have found. It does seem like there should be 2 different types of therapy, or at least different mechanisms in therapy for men versus women. But it feels like the traditional therapy, institution doesn't look at it that way.
Yeah, well, first off, you're very good at recalling data and research and past guests. It's impressive as a fellow podcast host. It's very impressive. There's a couple angles that I want to take here, because I think, number one, the therapeutic industry has become, I call it the therapeutic industrial complex, right? It's like
that's exactly the words I was going to use. Yes,
yeah,
the industrial, like the military industrial
really
complex.
It's really become a powerful structure and system within our modern narrative and conversation. I mean, look at the amount of therapy speak that is now used within modern culture. I mean, you have women going online after breakups being like, my ex-boyfriend was a narcissism, or he was an avoidant attachment, or, and diagnosing and pathologizing their partners. And it has become so rampant. And it's becoming that way because of a couple of things. Number one, women are dominating the therapeutic industry and space, dominating it. If you look at right now, on average, there are 75% of psychologists right now today are women. And like you said, if you go into university institutions and you go into therapeutic and psychological programs, it is predominantly women, right? It's really, depending on the institution, it's like up in the 90 percentile that you're going to find 90% of the attendees in the colleges and institutions are going to be female. You're going to have a lot of bias. You're going to have a lot of focus on women's issues. You have a lot of focus on treatment that is geared towards how women think and feel. And this is the big distinction that I've found between men and women, which is that women highly over prioritize subjective experience, meaning their internal experience and what they feel, what they're going through. And men are much more objective. So we as men are much more external, where we look outside of ourselves to assess a situation or a problem. That's just naturally how we're hardwired. And so the challenge with this, and the reason why a lot of men don't go into therapy and don't go see a psychologist, is that they don't feel like they're going to go in there and get results There's also social stigmas and a whole bunch of other pieces that play into it. But for the large part, a lot of guys are like, well, I've been to therapy and it really didn't help me. Or I went to therapy and they just told me to talk about my feelings. And so the therapeutic industry is really failing men right now because it's not approaching male problems in a male solution oriented way. And I'll just say one last piece here. Like, one, I'm not a therapist, and I did not go back to do my master's or my PhD in psychology because of this, because I fundamentally believe that you can have a greater impact on a system, on a structure from the outside, being an outlier on the outside, than trying to enter the system and change it from the inside. And proof of this is I'm going to speak at the largest psychology conference in March called the Psychology Networker, giving a presentation in front of 4,500 psychologists and therapists. And the presentation is a 2-hour workshop teaching psychologists and therapists how to work with men. And so you can see the industry starting to scramble and shift because they can't they can't ignore the challenges that men are having anymore. That raising suicide rates, the raising depression rates, the raising anxiety rates, it's all right in front of them. And the treatment methodology is terrible because men go in, they're dealing with suicidal ideation, they're dealing with depression, they're dealing with anxiety, and they sit in front of a therapist that treats them like a woman and says, tell me about your feelings versus here's some fucking solutions on how to deal with your goddamn problems. And then they walk out of there and they're like, well, that didn't help me at all. And then they go out into the world and they're like, therapy sucks, And so my whole thing is, I'm not a therapist for men. We are training men. We are training men to be more self-led. We're training men to actually learn how to lead themselves in their lives. And that's a much more effective approach than just tell me about how you're feeling.
Yeah. Chris Williamson, in your interview with him, I thought it was great. He said, in therapy, men are treated like defective women. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, like, when they say be more vulnerable, Connor, I'm trying to be real with you right now. This would be me being vulnerable right now. I'm expressive. If you were to ask me, do I have biases? I would explain to you I think the Texas Longhorns are the greatest football team in the entire world. I have biases. I'm very biased, and I'm aware of my biases, right? If you wanted me to be vulnerable, this is how I'd be vulnerable. I'm not going to punch a wall. I'm not going to cry, and I'm not going to believe that my subjective feelings outweigh objective reality just because I'm having an emotional response to something. And I use this example. Consider your house is on fire. The firefighters show up. Your family's in there, and the firefighter comes up to you and starts crying, and he starts telling you about the rough day that he had. Do you want that, or do you want the firefighter to have a stoic, blank look on his face, kick in your door, and go save your family? It's like this idea again, traditional masculinity, specifically stoicism. The American Psychological Association saw that as being harmful. What that tells me is that the people in the APA they're one derivative away from reality, at least one, maybe more than one derivative. Like they're so unconnected from reality and not recognizing stoic men built the world that made it a safe place for the American Psychological Association to say nonsense like this. And I feel like sometimes they don't recognize that ability. And the other thing is, you and I communicating now, this could be us being vulnerable. This is how we could communicate. We choose to communicate in a different way. Because we don't communicate our vulnerability the way women do, it doesn't mean that we're emotionally stunted. And I think that's a problem. Like you're saying, because we don't speak, women speak, therefore we're defective women. And I think that's essentially a problem. The way I say it is, I would be open to having a therapist if that therapist always understood that as a man, I have a burden of performance. Orion Taraban says it best. He goes, women can be captains or passengers. Men can only be captains. This idea, maybe in the future we can get to this point, but this idea of the stay-at-home husband who doesn't provide anything financially and takes care of the kids while the wife works, we're not at the point yet societally where we accept that fully. We're just not. And so as of right now, men have a burden of performance, or you're staying on your mother's couch. That's kind of where we're living right now. And if I have a therapist who's telling me that anything other than that, I just don't think that works. And so that would be my one concern with the way therapy is done now. Is like, as long as the therapist understands I still have to get the work done no matter how I feel about it, even if I haven't worked through my issues, I still need to be able to get the work done.
Well, I think the larger issue that no one really, I haven't heard anybody talk about it. The larger issue for me is that in my perspective, modern therapy has been infiltrated by feminist ideology. And what I mean by that is that when
Time out. You should listen to Rollo Tomasi. That's all he talks about.
does he? Okay.
Modern feminism getting into therapy. He literally talks about it every week. Yeah, you should talk to Rollo. Yeah, he talks about this all the time. Yeah.
Though, like the main thing for me is when you look at the American Psychology Association, the APA guidelines, the first thing that you'll see is that they've separated masculinity from biology. So they say like the first point, masculinity is a social construct. It's like, well, hold on. So you're going to completely separate the biology of men and women from their psychology? Like, what are you talking about? So, I think it's a big challenge that the therapeutic and psychological industry is really waking up to. And I think guys like Jordan Peterson have done a good job at really trying to shine a light on some of this stuff. I mean, he's gone, out into other endeavors and he's not really talking about it as much anymore. But, it's a big, big problem because a lot of men, that are looking for support, that are looking to, just be better in some way, whether this be a better husband or partner or, develop leadership skills. Those things, there are very simple, very tactical, very proven psychological principles that can support men. But there's nobody teaching men those things. And I think that's one of the reasons why Peterson got so popular in the first place. It's like, he wasn't teaching anything revolutionary. He's saying, make your fucking bed. Right? Yeah. It's like, make your bed, stand up straight. He was the archetype. I'm a big Jungian proponent, but he was an archetype of the father archetype in a time when there was a vacancy in that. And then the other thing that I'll just put in there is I wrote a chapter in my book, Men's Work, called The Myth of Male Vulnerability. And I think we're living in this time where there's this myth that modern men are being told that is very feminine oriented, which is very simple. The solution to all your problems is to be more vulnerable. If you're just more vulnerable, that'll solve all your problems. And the challenge is that a lot of guys try and execute on this, and they end up running around in circles for years because they're like, well, I've been vulnerable. I've opened up to women. I've talked to my buddies. And I've talked about my issues endlessly, but none of them's changed. And so, and then on top of that is compounded by the fact that when a man does open up, sometimes what happens is a woman can't hear it, or she rejects him, or, she becomes sexually disengaged. And so we have to find some type of balance where, and I'm not advocating against being open and transparent. I think vulnerability in itself isn't the devil. It's not an enemy to men. I think that men just need to find other people, other men, that they can be transparent with, and that they can actually work through some of those problems with. Because there's a saying, and I'll just wrap this up here. There's a saying that my mentor, my colleague, he's 74. He's trained thousands and thousands of psychologists. Really incredible dude. He's like, if Obi-Wan Kenobi was a cowboy in the mountains of Colorado, he's like 74 years old, missing a thumb, broke his pelvis. He's like a really rough and ragged dude, but he's a therapist. And he has a very simple statement, which I think is applicable for us as men to remember, which is, we are wounded in relationship and we have to heal in relationship. And for a lot of us as men, we have pain and wounds in our core from other men, from our fathers, from stepfathers, from uncles, from friends, from coaches. And we've never really had a chance to chew on that and heal that with other men. And so we owe it to one another to find a way through the shitstorm that is currently modern psychology.